Steve Lee, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Nick.
Glad you're here. I love you a lot. The great and mighty powerful Steve Lee. Tell us who you are and what you're doing here.
And I'm just thrilled to be invited. I've had so many of my friends that have been on here, and and appreciate the job you do with the podcast. I've been working here at Cumberland Heights for 5 years and just waiting for my spot here in the hot seat.
Yeah? I'm just counting the days.
Counting the days.
Good. And today, you've done a lot of different things for Cumberland Heights, but tell us what you're doing today.
My primary role today is Senior Director of Strategic Relationships, which I often kid. That's a title I gave myself, by the way, and you should always assign a title ambiguous enough that no one can really measure your productivity or lack of.
Both of Chief Science Officer, the National Director of Strategic Relations. We're just living in the gray?
Yeah. In the gray, perhaps. But at its best, I think that I get to go around nationally and spend time kind of telling people about Cumberland Heights and making them aware of really the number of changes and the growth that we've had as an institution over the years, and then work with a lot of our corporate partners around the country and work with the airlines. So it's just gives me a chance to go all around and visit with a lot of people that I enjoy hanging out with at a lot of places I enjoy going.
Yeah. You're particularly focused in a specific vertical. An outside business might describe, right? Which is peer organization relationships, big accounts associated with some EAPs, or you mentioned the airlines.
Work with the airlines, work with labor unions, work with the interventionists, work with EAPs, and then again, as you said, a lot of our other providers around the country that we collaborate with and have relationships with.
Yeah. So what's the goal? What's the goal of those relationships?
Ultimately, it's to expand the reach, make sure that we've got the types of relationships and understanding of resources that are available around the country to help people find what's the right fit for them if it turns out that we're not.
Yeah.
And likewise, let people know what we're doing and how we're doing it, and so they can feel comfortable referring to us when it's in the client's best interest.
Yeah. There's a lot that I want to ask you. I've been kind of preparing our discussion today just mentally. And 2 questions. One, how have you seen the field change by way of local treatment versus travel for treatment? And the second, what do you think big organizations need to know about a treatment center in order to effectively create a partnership?
Well, those are big picture questions, which are supposed to be the ones, by the way, that I can answer. But I think locally, what we've seen is tremendous growth, and that's true here locally for us, but that's true all around the country. You see a huge uptick in the IOP services and partial hospitalization services, and a lot more, I won't call it specialization, in fact, maybe just the opposite, that the menu of services has grown so dramatically, whether it be our folks here locally and nationally, that you begin to hear a lot of language, right? You hear trauma-informed treatment, you hear experiential, you hear motivational interviewing, you hear a ton of language around this that sometimes it feels like you've gone to a Jersey diner that has everything on the menu. And what I tell people about Cumberland Heights is, we have a focused expertise. We know who we are, we know what we do, and we know how we do it, though we continue to learn and grow there. But if I tell folks, if you're going to a restaurant that serves meatloaf and sushi, they're probably not doing one of them well. And so we want to make sure people understand what we do, how we do it, and then the culture. I think that with the advent of private equity into this field over the last 12 to 15 years and growing all the time, that's not a bad thing at all, that treatment is accessible to more people than ever. And what I say is that there's more and better treatment than there's ever been. There's more sophisticated treatment than there's ever been. And never has it been harder to identify where you as an individual or where a family that's looking for help for a friend or family member to send somebody.
Yeah.
Because like any industry, there's a great variation of the kind and quality of treatment that's out there.
Why do you think behavioral health or addiction treatment services broadly at times can get a bad rap across popular culture?
Well, I think there's at least two different lenses to look through there. When you look at the general public that's looking at it, it's funny when you've got someone. We spend a lot of time talking about addiction, alcoholism as an illness, as a disease like other diseases. Yet it's such a personal thing, and it devastates families and friends and relationships in such a personal way that when there's a cost of providing these services. And I think people get sometimes it feels off-putting. Somebody who wouldn't think twice about going to a hospital and having to pay to have their appendix removed struggle with the fact that there's a financial component to behavioral health and addiction and mental health. On the other hand, I think that also there, like in any industry, there are some anecdotally, if not systemically, there are some people who are more interested in the money than the mission. And that can leave a bad taste in people's mouths. So you can have people who are provided and offered and perhaps even arm twisted a little bit toward some services that maybe they don't need and because of the cost rather than of the benefit.
Yeah. I think Gary Fisher, a couple weeks ago, you were here with him when he was on the show. He spoke about that in terms of sort of the evolution of the field and the growing up of our professional identity, an increase in professionalism that he was able to observe over his long career. And I think, too, something that we all struggle with is the dichotomy between medicine and behavioral health is quite different. So if you break your femur, it's pretty binary in terms of understanding, oh no, this bone is broken. But if you experience addiction, it's a lot more difficult to effectively measure and codify that brokenness outside of the behaviors that might be observed in that individual's life, right?
Well,
which is really difficult.
First, I will say that if you asked Gary Fisher a question, there is no need to ask me the same question because Gary has provided the perfect answer. Nobody I respect more in the field than Gary. But you're right. It is hard to measure. A lot of your job here at Cumberland Heights is to help us begin to try to measure outcomes, if you will, to use data. But in my own personal recovery, years ago, I had a mentor say to me, I was coming up on what was then year 4 or 5, drug and alcohol free. And he said, Steve, all this does is measure. He said, the only thing quantifiable in our recovery is that date between the last time you used a drug or took a drink and today. But you can't measure your spiritual growth. You can't measure your in any other areas. Those things are unquantifiable, and I think that's true. And all of those things ebb and flow. I haven't had a drink or a drug in over 34 years, but there's some days I show up better or worse than other days, and that is not a measure of recovery not working. It's usually a measure of where I am in that process.
How did you get into recovery? What's that story?
Reluctantly. And there's a great line in the movie Shawshank Redemption. The guys are sitting around in the cafeteria, the mess hall in the prison, and the new guy is asking, how did you get here? And, that's a question they say you don't ask. But the guys around the table all answered, well, lawyer screwed me, using more colorful language than that. And I got to recovery because a lawyer screwed me. So if I'd had a better lawyer, I wouldn't have gotten here, right? But the truth is I had some legal issues from DUI that were going to give me some time in incarcerated and or go to drug and alcohol rehabilitation. In fact, they said that word, that sentence, and I wasn't sure what it was, but it sounded marginally better than jail. And so I said, okay, I'll do that. And so July the 1st of 1989, I walked into a treatment center here in the Nashville area, out in Brentwood, just south of here. It's no longer open. It was a place called the Harbors of Brentwood. And I went against my will, but was introduced to an understanding of the problem I had in a way that I had not been able to grasp it before. And that has led me to today.
Where were you at in your life at this time? Give us a window into Steve Lee walking into treatment.
It was interesting. I lived here. I was 35 years old. I had been married for 7 years to my wife, Connie, and my daughter, Abby, was 5 years old at the time. I was working in a family business, which I did for 38 years before I wandered into this industry a few years ago. I had a good job. Most of my bills were paid. It looked like, I'm the poster boy for middle-class alcoholism, because it looked okay from the outside looking in. But that is not what was going on. I was not the husband or father that I wanted to be, and certainly that they wanted me to be.
Did you have that awareness back then? Like you really did want to be a better version of yourself, or were you blinded by alcoholism? Yeah.
Now I will say that, but it's interesting in the recovery literature. There's a line that talks about the fact that the alcoholic / drug addict perhaps can't differentiate the true from the false, and his alcoholic life seems the only normal one. Well, I can tell you now, looking back, that it is amazing to me that I could normalize some of the behavior that was going on. And so it's kind of like when you're sitting in the middle of it, it's hard to spot sometimes. There's the story of the two fish swimming in the ocean, and the one fish turns to the other and says, how's the water? And the other fish says, what's this water you're talking about? So when we're in the middle of it, it's hard to see, and that was certainly true of me. But I knew that I was falling short in some of those areas, some of it trying to do better but not being able to execute, some of it acting in a way that was contradictory to the person that I wanted to be but unable to not do it. And all of that was drowned in a bunch of alcohol and drugs to help dull and medicate those feelings on some occasions, and fuel and fire them up on others.
When did you start using? How old were you?
I was 18 years old. I had, I grew up in Smyrna, Tennessee, just out, 30, 40 miles from here. And as I always say, I was a good kid that went where he said he was going to go and was with who I said I was going to be with, and came home when I said I was going to come home. And at freshman in college at 18 years old is when I had the first drink that was purposeful. That was me drinking with some guys rather than just a sip of daddy's beer or something at home. And it was an experience that lit me up.
You remember that first one?
Oh, I very much remember. And that's not true of everyone, but I was in the back seat of a 1968 canary yellow Volkswagen Bug. The guys handed back, this was 1972, and guys handed back a bottle of Boone's Farm Strawberry Hill wine.
Oh.
And people laugh at that, but it was sweet enough that a non-drinker could drink it, right?
Of course.
And I say after a few drinks, all of a sudden I couldn't wait to get where we were going, because I thought people couldn't wait to see me when I got there. Yeah, I said the back seat of that Bug wasn't big enough to hold me now.
Yeah, right.
And so I remember that feeling. I don't remember the evening, and I blacked out. I'm a blackout drinker, and the comedian David Tell said that he's a blackout drinker, as he likes to call it, time travel. And that's what, and that continued in my drinking quite a bit, that time travel, it was like, whoa, How did I get here in the future, and what has been going on, and I've connected with a lot of people at this level who've done the same thing, where you kind of go that next day, and rather than ask people questions, you just try to read their faces, and how did it go, and was I just kind of cute last night, or did it go really off the rails? And then we've all got that friend you can call that was there, right, and said, man, tell me. And you go, oh, Steve, even you don't want to know, man. It was so. And while looking back at it now, I always like people to know that I can look back and see, how incredulous this life looked looking back at it. But in the middle of it, I couldn't. And it wasn't fun when it was happening. I had fun times, but at the times that were strange to me were the sober times.
Right.
When something was missing, when there was a feeling I couldn't articulate and couldn't tell you why.
Right. So from 18 to 35, did you drink alcoholically pretty consistently, or was there seasons?
Well, I tell people I don't know whether from that first drink of Boone's Farm, whether I drank alcoholically or not from that moment on, because I drank so enthusiastically. And, one of the descriptions of alcoholism is that when you honestly want to, you can't stop entirely. Or if when drinking, you have little control over the amount you take. Well, you don't know if you can stop entirely if you don't try. And you don't know if you can moderate your drinking if you don't try, and I did not try. I will say that it initially became, it was weekends primarily, right away. And then weekends got a little, started a little earlier and lasted a little longer. Then it became Thursdays through. And then I would come in and I was that primary wine. You could drink legally at 18 back then. But Rutherford County, where I was living and where I was going to school at MTSU, was a dry county. So I'd come into Nashville with a couple of buddies each week, and we would I'd buy me a case of that Boone's Farm wine and put it in the back of what was then a pretty cool 1971 Camaro. But in the summers, that wine would get pretty hot in the trunk of that car, but that did not deter me.
Right.
And it went on, and then we introduced, I began to accentuate that with some drugs, first marijuana, and then a host of other things. And then went to work in a family business, which was a sales and marketing thing. So my job literally initially was that of the traveling salesman.
Yeah.
And
let me fast forward. I'm curious, what was early recovery like for you in Nashville of 1989?
It was really great for me in that somewhere in that treatment experience in July of 1989, I did arrive at the conclusion that I need to not drink, which kind of grew into I want to not drink. And use other drugs, and so I came out and I fell into a group of enthusiastic people right away who were further along in their recovery and in their abstinence, and they showed me right away that didn't have to be a dull and boring existence, and I made real community with people. And it took a little while. It took about 6 months for me to realize that people were, at first I was just going to meetings and going home and doing different things. And then I realized people were talking to each other, right? They were building relationships. And I got invited into that. And I actually got excited pretty early and fell in love with that process.
What was the recovery community like in Nashville at that time in the late 80s, early 90s? Like, what groups were frequented? Are some of the same, some different? What's your observations been of that?
Well, there are some that are still around.
Yeah.
I went to one earlier today that was around in 1989 as well. We've had a couple of recovery clubhouses here in town that were around back then, and I went to those. certainly it was all the facilities and anywhere that housed a 12-step meeting had smoking, and so it was heavy smoke everywhere. And I was a non-smoker, so that was a little challenging for me. And that was just about when people were starting to begin to have some non-smoking meetings, and it was a pretty divisive, at least hotly contested topic for a while for different folks. But that's, it looked, there weren't nearly the number of options for people to go to meetings back then. Most of the meetings were at night, 8 p.m. on. There were some earlier in the day meetings, but the vast majority were at night. It was years ago, the presumption is that, number one, it was a lot more men than women in recovery. That has begun to even out a lot more percentage-wise. The meetings would be at 8 o'clock because the presumption was that people were going to go to work, go home, have dinner with their family, with their kids, and then go out to a meeting if that's what they were doing. Over time, that has, there are meetings all time of day and night to accommodate people's schedules and needs.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you some good questions, I think, but what, if you don't mind sharing, because no is an acceptable answer, but what are the things what are the main ideas? What are the themes of struggle that you've experienced in recovery throughout your 3+ decades?
Well, it's ever evolving because this isn't something that's done. And for me, once the alcohol and drugs were set aside, and for those who participate in 12-step recovery or any approach that someone might take to their own recovery, in my case, it has been a 12-step path, and there are over 200 12-step programs around, and I don't speak for any of them, but it turns for me into a spiritual journey, which, by the way, is about the only journey that there really is from my perspective. But it's about subtraction rather than addition. It's about recognizing that that the stories I'd been telling myself aren't true. It had been a recognition that insecurities are pretty much shared by everyone, and a lot of the things that I thought, and I don't mean behaviors, I mean the internal feelings that I thought were perhaps specific to me only, are shared by a lot of folks. And over time, as I've been in community with people who are willing to share openly and transparently about not just what they've done, but how they feel, that has really connected me more to, and that's what was missing for me, was connection. There's a lot of discussion. I think that my wife and I were having some marriage counseling about 4 years into my sobriety, and my wife is sober as well. She pursued sobriety 10 days after me. But we took a little different route for those first few years, and we were getting some marriage counseling. And the therapist said she'd like to talk to me one-on-one. And of course, I thought that made sense to me. We would get together and talk about my wife. But what actually happened was she said, and she stunned me. This was a seminal moment for me in my life. That she said, "Steve, you must really be lonely." And I was knocked off balance by that, because that's not the word I would have used a moment before she said it. But when she said it, it resonated with me. And she said, she said, "I bet you're pretty good company, and I bet people enjoy having you around." And she said, "I bet at a social event you go give 5 minutes over here and 5 minutes over there, but when you leave and get in your car to go home, you're empty inside." And man, she had accurately described something that I wouldn't have been able to describe before she did it. And it really threw me for a loop. But that, I think, that is more common than I had thought of a lot of people. The literature I read says that the alcoholic knows loneliness as few do. And so that's not a lack of people in our lives, it's a lack of genuine internal connection to that, at least for me. So that's been, that's a lot of this recovery is about not learning something new. It's about shedding old ideas, and it's about shedding that ego that gets in my way. I always say the pride and ego, as we describe it in recovery, which is just the mind, is they show up dressed as your friends and say, we're here to help, but like the government, they're not. And because it looks like that pride that has me not letting you see behind the curtain, that seemingly protecting myself, is the very thing that is blocking me from other people, and that is the source of that loneliness. Now, that would have scared me off day 2 or 3, but I know, look, in retrospect, and that's the only way, life is lived forward but understood backwards. Mm-hmm. It's understood in the rearview mirror. Mm-hmm. And I go, oh, this is what's been happening. And so that's, if I was to tell you what's been the biggest revelation, if you will, through my recovery, it is that I am, that we are all much more alike than I thought, and that I'm not getting ready to be okay, I'm already okay.
One of the things that strikes me about us, and I know you pretty well, and we've shared many a airline adjacent seating and conversation and around here, of course, and people that experience addiction, and maybe people in general, I certainly know myself, that we're definitely the protagonist in our own story. We are the main character. And one of the things that you really eloquently described is how you shed that false ego. So one of the other things I'm curious about, just in general, about why are we so protective? What does block us away from those moments of being able to be vulnerable or be genuine or be authentic that might help somebody see us? And oh, by the way, even though we think that might not be helpful, actually the process of doing that is very helpful. And it's not really until recovery, from my own experience, that I was able to really experience any of that relief, because I thought that surely that's not the answer. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's certainly the way that I showed up. And let me be clear, I have not shed that pride and ego or that hyper self-consciousness completely, but I am aware of it. So now, when the old saying goes, I've met the enemy and it is me, well, I believe that now, but only in the sense that again, as you said, I think the ego's job is to separate me from you. It sends messages that be careful. It's, it has me living on high alert. It has me saying, no, when I was telling you about being in early recovery and recognizing that people were beginning to build relationships, I was with a group one day, and at the end of our time together, somebody said, we're all going to lunch. Who wants to go? And I remember desperately wanting to go and getting in my car to go over to the identified restaurant, and about halfway there turning off and going home. And the next week, same thing, same time, same restaurant, and I turned off and went home. And I was unable or unwilling to have an uncomfortable, what I viewed as a potentially uncomfortable or embarrassing moment. I was afraid I might go in and there would already be 6 people sitting at a table for 6. And I didn't know whether to ask someone to scoot over or make room for me, or do you even remember that I was in the room with you? And I've got a friend that says that we would rather be dead than embarrassed. And so that self-consciousness, which I've been taught is the root of my trouble, this hyper self-consciousness, what I think you think becomes, and often unconsciously, but is ruling my life. So I'm all constantly trying to make myself be other than I am to fit. I had a guy who told me one day, he said, Steve, you're not who you think you are. And he said, and you're not who they think you are. But you're especially not who you think they think you are. And I realized then how often that was true of me, that you're getting ready to go into a room and you go, okay, what do I need to be in this environment? And we all want to adapt to where we are at some level, but to constantly be acting rather than being is an exhausting way to live. And a drink made that easier. And I also had to spend a lot of time alone to rest up from all that acting.
It's powerful. I wish we could just bottle this up and have Steve just go through every step of the way and put this on the podcast, and it would be much more valuable than some of the other nonsense that I've been spewing. But I think that I've said this before, so for those that have heard it, out of the 5 people in my own family that listen to every episode, what I would say is one of my favorite things about recovery is it doesn't care what you think about it, right? And it was one of my own seminal processes of understanding that I was so fixated on trying to logically tackle recovery or the relationship with my higher power or what was going to happen in the steps. And really, as some of the literature that is read around here or in meetings outside of this organization, I had a lot of contempt prior to investigation, and it had nothing to do, the benefit of recovery had nothing to do about what I thought about it. It just had something to do with, was I willing to not take the exit as you described? Was I willing to follow some good orderly direction even though it felt like the wrong thing to do, and show up to Denny's. I'm not sure that was the restaurant, or show up because Cracker Barrel was my day.
We were going to Shoney's.
Excuse me. Shout out to Shoney's. But whether it's Shoney's or Cracker Barrel or wherever you are, it's that moment of uncomfortability that, is so easy to, I think, allow our kind or certainly me to disconnect from an experience thinking that I know what's going to happen.
Well, I think, one of the gifts and challenges that we're given in adopting a 12-step approach to recovery is that, to your point, I'm asked to now start taking actions, not based on what I think, feel, or believe, but on principle, on these guidelines that are laid out, because I have forever been making decisions based on what I think, feel, and believe. Mm-hmm. And it's often, to your point, the principle that I'm encouraged to use as a compass, as a spiritual true north, looks like this couldn't possibly work. This
Right.
can't possibly be in my best interest. I say it's like when you're going down the road and your GPS says, take a left at the next light, and you go, no, I've been where I'm going. This is not how you get there, and I don't do it. And pretty soon it's going, rerouting, and will nudge me back in the right direction.
Yeah.
And here, same thing. It looks like there's so many things that don't. Logic is no defense against my alcoholism, right? Logic, if it made perfect sense that I should do some things differently long before I was able to. Mm-hmm. And likewise, logic isn't necessarily a good guideline for how I live my daily life. It can be a part of it, but I don't want it to be the dominating factor. I want to look to principle.
I'm going to shift gears on you a little bit. What do you think are the challenges for people who identify as in recovery who work in a recovery-informed discipline like a treatment center?
Well, with that painting in broad strokes, everyone, I think one of the, some of the things that I see and people that I talk to, especially for those folks that are patient facing, right? That are interacting every day, either out here, our wonderful therapists and techs and people who are interacting with our patients every day. Somebody who runs sober living, who is dealing with the men and women in that environment every day. Somebody who's doing that professionally. The end of the day can come and you can go, okay, I've been having this conversation all day long. I've been talking to these men or women, and yet I've been taught from day one not to confuse my work life as a replacement for the things I need to do to take care of my personal recovery. So I think that can be a challenge, a legitimate one that's hard for people. I think that that some people can maybe even unknowingly believe that they are engaged in their recovery because they've had conversations about it. And real recovery is about application beyond the conversation. So what am I doing? And so that's, and I see a lot of people who get a little disengaged from their own personal recovery because they're involved in the treatment aspect of recovery.
Yeah. And I've had seasons where that's happened in my own life. And I've had to get really serious about, luckily, having maybe a person around me or a brief moment of God-centered insight to say, hey, maybe I should stop thinking so much that I've got everything under control and I should just practice the basics. Because I think what's scary to me as a person in recovery who works in this field is self-deception, or a person in recovery that wants to remain in recovery is self-deception. Not being able to see what I can't see. And how that can slowly creep over a period of time. Like when I don't know if I've said this before, but when I had a year of recovery, my first year of recovery, I was amped, and I'm still amped, but like outwardly amped, where I have said this before, I have a memory of actually being on a flight and sitting next to a stranger and asking them, like, have they heard of recovery? And then just vomiting and pulling out literature and showing them the step working guide and all, I was very self-righteous and excited about this way of life. And as time's gone on, 5 years after that, I was less sure about what I knew. 10 years after that, 14 years, I know what works for me and that's about it. And I buy into that and I try to serve other people to try to freely give in what was been given to me so that I can keep it, right? I mean, it's pretty simple, but I see how you get the family and you get the house and you get responsibilities, and the creep of not participating in recovery is really real. And there's a lot of, I'm not an expert in it, I'm just saying that it's something that I think is worth mentioning for somebody who's lived it for over 30 years and been in this field and had a lot of friends that seen a lot of patterns unfold. How about that? Well,
you make some keen observations and points, and
but I'm not an expert. I'm just saying, but
what
real.
I'm saying though is what you said. All I have is the experience of what works for me, and that's the only thing that we really have to share with somebody.
Yeah.
And so,
right, I guess there's like no judgment in anybody else's recovery. I'm just like saying, for me, I know it's really valuable that I do these things in my own life. That's all that I know.
I have a number of people, as any of us might, who might ask me if I think do you think I'm alcoholic or a drug addict? Do you think, and my answer is always, why do you ask? Because if your life is going just the way you want it, for God's sake, don't let me screw it up, But if things are going sideways, if there's some things that are problematic, then let's, I can share my experience around that. The same thing about somebody who's chosen recovery and you got the everything from the casual participant to the zealot, and there's room for all of that in there. it's what's working for me, because we're not trying to earn a merit badge. We're not trying to win, Recovery Person of the Month award, though I am a 3-time winner. But we are trying to just find our way back to a good life, right? How can I be that good husband, that good father? But there's a saying that says, "Don't let the life recovery gave me take me away from my recovery life." Because I can begin in and recognize that being engaged in this recovery, which is a design for living, it's not about meeting attendance, it's not about all of these other things. There's a broad scope of things that I adopt as a way of life.
Yeah. By the way, I am like the best version of myself, I believe, when I'm able to be genuine, authentic, vulnerable, and honest with other men in my life who are also in recovery. But when I don't, man, it is so easy to talk about what addiction was like 14 years ago. I got no problem telling you or Stacy or Christina or Ryan or a stranger that I met for the first time that, I used to use this drug every day that ends in Y, and it really didn't turn out well for me. But it is really hard today, Steve, to talk about the things that aren't going well in my life today.
Well, I've always said, or for a long time, that the easiest thing I do, and I get the opportunity to share my recovery story a lot, and the easiest thing is to talk about what I was like. In fact, we will begin
at a strange place.
Yeah, we'll begin to
people.
embellish that. You get street cred for that stuff in the recovery world.
Yeah, you're talking about like going to a convention or anything. Like it's sometimes easier than sharing in your home group.
I tell people I used to have a much more exciting story than I have now. I mean, it wasn't true, but it was exciting, and I discovered that what we do and is tell each other exactly what happened to us. So I don't need to hide from anything that happened, and I don't need to embellish something that didn't happen. The reason we all in recovery tell our stories to each other, whether it's somewhere giving a talk from a podium or over coffee, is that our stories are going to land where they're supposed to land. My story doesn't resonate with everybody, and yours wouldn't. But so we both tell them, and they land where they're supposed to be helpful. But at 34 years sober and active in recovery, I have to guard against being willing to have a problem that I go, I can't let them know this now.
Right.
Because I'm not supposed to have that challenge, whatever that is, or I'm not supposed to feel that way.
Right.
So if you get into image management in your recovery, that's a dangerous spot.
Right.
And I've been there, but I get it.
Yeah. So,
but let me share this story with you if I can real quick.
Yeah.
I was speaking at a conference before a bunch of people a number of years ago, and my wife was with me. And as I said, Connie is likewise an active recovering person, and I was sharing at great length what I used to be like and telling people what happened, and now I was talking about what I'm like now. And we got up to our room later that evening, and she said, that last 10 or 15 minutes of that talk? I said, yes, I do. And she said, I would love to meet that guy. I wish you would bring him home sometime. And so one of the things that I learned from that, and it was lighthearted, but there was some truth behind it, right? And what I realized is that how I see me is not always how other people see me.
Or experience you, yeah. It's not
but
the
other truth with that, is how I see you is never the whole picture. So for years, unawakened and unaware, had relationships typically based on our worst moment together, where you disappointed me. That is who you are to me. Long after, so I kept you in the cage long after the statute of limitations had expired on that misdemeanor, which I'm treating as a felony. And so that I understand that that's not the truth anymore. It doesn't always free me up from the judgment, but I recognize that is that there's always more going on.
Yeah, very well said, my friend. Very well said. With this last little bit of time that we have, what do you see in our culture? What do you see in the clients that are choosing Cumberland Heights today in their lives? What are they struggling with? What would you tell a family searching for treatment options, what to look for, how to make a good decision?
Nick,
that was about 5 questions. So just
please
tackle
really
them one by one.
It's challenging, but I've had several of those conversations in the last couple of days, and I tell you what was this morning.
Yeah.
Had a man come to admit into Cumberland Heights, and I was out. I met him and his friend that drove him. They came from out of state, and I was out at their car while we waited for them to be ready to go in. And another patient walked by who I don't know, but he said, "Are you giving them the pep talk?" And I said, I hadn't started yet. I said, "Come on over here for a minute." And I said, "How long have you been out here?" He said, "I've been here 10 days. I said, "Well, tell this guy about what that 10 days been like." And I didn't know what he might say.
Right.
But he became, he probably put this guy more at ease about being here than certainly I could, because he is 10 days into this process.
Yeah.
So that was kind of a neat thing. I talk to families. I want them to always make the most informed decision they can. So when I'm talking to someone, I encourage them to gather information, and that I'm not interested in bringing someone here that we're not the right fit for. So it is not a business transaction. Can we be of most help? When I'm referring out to other places, and I think, I know you know this because we've all had this conversation, but often I'm referring to people, not places. Often I want to be able to trust that the individual, because there might be a facility somewhere that I haven't been able to spend a lot of time. I certainly don't know the clinical team necessarily, but I know people that I trust and I know have the best interest of individuals at top of mind, rather than just trying to get folks into their program. And so I think that's, I tell people not to fall strictly for the website marketing, but talk to somebody. And I will say that I'm grateful that if people want to speak to one of our clinicians, I'm often able to make that happen before coming, to allow them to tell me what that's going to be like, or let me tell you a little bit about me to see if I'm a fit. If it is around financial stuff, we want to have as much clarity around that as possible. We don't want people to be surprised. There's there's insurance and often a financial component accompanying that insurance, and I want people to know how much it's going to cost or how little, and just so people aren't surprised by anything.
Yeah, it's a big commitment. I mean, it can be a life-changing decision. What do you think, Steve, makes Cumberland Heights unique?
Repeat.
Shout out to John. What do you think makes Cumberland Heights unique?
Well,
what are you most proud of here?
Well, what makes me most comfortable here, and I've worked at a couple other places before being here at Cumberland Heights the last 5 years. I had a long history coming out here on a volunteer basis, and know it. And it doesn't make, to your point, unique doesn't mean better.
Yep.
And it's not a judgment anywhere else. I know what we do here. I know the staff. I know the people. So I have great comfort. I worked for a company that had multiple programs around the country, and that's a good thing too. Like I said, people can help folks find something perhaps within their family of programs that best suits their needs. But for me to be in alignment, I've got to know the people on the ground and the people doing the work, and I know the staff here. So I think there's a culture here that I'm very comfortable with. Doesn't make it better, but I feel aligned with our mission and aligned with the people that do it.
I think that's important. Anytime you're trying to get, it's important when you're deciding whether or not to invest somebody's life into a professional's hands, that you know who the people are. To be honest, it's part of the reason why we're doing this. You know, it's easy to put a headshot on a website. You know, we're making a more informed investment in platforms like this to let people get to know who we are a little bit more behind sort of, you know, a press release or, you know, a super formal, you know, email announcement of some kind, but who is Steve Lee in this role, has a responsibility and care of this organization and the folks who are going to choose it, you know, because we're all temporary proprietors, you know, today. And so it's our responsibility to make sure that this place is safe and effective and that the most people we can have access, which is super important. Something I'm really proud of, actually, is our ability to provide access to especially anybody in Tennessee that needs treatment for addiction. We're here for them. What's coming on the horizon for us organizationally? You tell me, man.
Well, news to you, I'm sure, Nick. But really, the exciting stuff for me is that we're adding a girls' adolescent program by the end of this year. That we are exploring making our professionals program more robust and seeing what that's going to look like. Some of that is still under consideration, but I think we're moving that way. And I know that we're getting ready next month to have a groundbreaking ceremony on some enhancements here on our campus, and both additions and enhancements. So that's exciting.
Yeah, it is. It is very exciting. One, if I had to I'll add my 2 cents for today, where today's mind. I wish that we did a better job communicating our presence throughout the state. You know, I think being centered in Nashville in terms of our headquarters, we can be very centered in Nashville, you know, and there are, you know, we have clinics in Jackson, Knoxville, all the way south to Chattanooga, and all the way north to Clarksville, and many places in between. And often I find that it comes to a surprise to some that, oh, wait, I thought y'all were just doing residential treatment. So anyways, that's my one bit for today.
I think that you're right. And when you asked that question earlier, I do think that I'm trying more and more to get people out here to our campus and to our other campuses, our Stillwaters program, our Arch Academy, and our outpatient locations, because even people who think they know us well are surprised sometimes when they take a closer look and go, I didn't know you did that, or I didn't know you did it that well, or I didn't know you did it that way. And so I think we haven't always done as great a job, and that falls kind of on the team I'm a part of in outreach and business development of communicating that effectively.
So I've been thinking the past few days about how to tell you this. This is kind of what we're going to end on, so I can eliminate your option to respond. But, you know, we've had a lot of great experiences together in terms of my perspective. I'm not sure if I'm one of those that's in a cage past the misdemeanor, but and I'm going to say something, and I hope it lands appropriately and isn't misinterpreted, but, you know, you're our Gary Fisher, you know, and your impact and presence here at Cumberland Heights for the past 5 years has been monumental. And I tell you all the time, you're on the do not release list. You know, like you're not allowed to move on. And I really mean that. And I really love you. And I hope you feel as valued and loved here in our health system as I think you really are, man, brother. Well,
that's generous and kind of you, Nick. I appreciate it. And certainly I feel the same way. And about you and so many of our team and staff out here.
Yeah.
Anytime you compare me to Gary Fisher, I'll take that. And
well, you guys are two individuals, but I knew you knew what I would mean.
I do. I do, and that's it is quite a compliment.
Yeah.
And I love being here.
Yeah. It's a good place.
One of the things you talked about earlier, and I'll end with this, is one of the things that makes me comfortable at Cumberland Heights. We talked earlier in this conversation about being able to be who you are, not image management. And I've never worked anywhere where I'm freer to be who I am and let that land and hope that serves positively, but I don't but I get to be who I am. Get to have very personal conversations with people like you and many others, and and share myself in a personal way, and be gifted and privileged to have people share themselves in a personal way back. So that's important to me.
Yeah. Well, thank you, man. We love you. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you for having me.